About 13 years late in finally starting to watch the show Parenthood. It's a drama that was on TV starting in 2010. And the show is about 3 generations of the Braverman family. Zeke and Camille are the grandparents, and they have 5 adult children, and then their children are the main characters of the show. I'm about 3 episodes in, and I'm already hooked. It's very real life, but not in a depressing way, but in a sort of redemptive way. So in the very first episode, the whole family, all 3 generations of them, are at Camille and Zeke's house for dinner. And after dinner, Zeke takes his 9-year-old grandson, Max, out to the driveway to shoot hoops. Now, Max, as a 3rd grader, is a little bit timid, and things continue to unfold about Max's life in the next episodes, but Max is a little bit timid and small as a 3rd grader. But Grandpa Zeke, as they're playing and Max has the ball, Grandpa Zeke is doing this thing with his tall body, guarding Zeke everywhere, and trying to body check him and move him out of the way, and in the process, Max takes an elbow to the nose, which of course starts bleeding, which of course brings about panic in the 3 generations of the family. And then, while Grandma puts ice on Max's nose, we see this conversation between Grandpa Zeke and Max's dad, Adam. "Dad, what are you doing?" "What? What are you doing?" "Oh, Adam, you know the boy has some height deficiencies. We need to make him a ball handler." "Do you really need to play him that hard?" "Hey, you weren't any different. You had to get over your fears too." "We're not raising him the way you raised us, all right?" "Oh, okay. What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I don't want him to feel like everything in life is a war." "Oh, Sonny, it is a war." Does that conversation sound familiar to anyone? Anyone had that conversation with their parents, or your adult child had that conversation with you? "Dad, we're not doing it the way you did it." Now, parenting seems to be a trigger point for these kinds of things, but it comes up about everything, whether or not you have kids, how you do laundry, how you cut your grass, or politics. The need to say, "We're not doing it the way you did it." It's a thing we all have to decide and then act on in one area of our lives or another in order to grow up. So our text for today is about a new generation figuring out how to do things differently than their parents and grandparents. Now we need to pause here before we go any further. David already said that I'm starting a generosity series in conjunction with the generosity team, who helps us as a congregation think about how do we grow in generosity as individuals and as a congregation. So there's all kinds of disclaimers I have to give first. The more I lead this church through sort of breaking away from a lot of the harmful things of the past that the church and Christianity have done, I feel like the more disclaimers I have to give. So here we go. So I think that most of Christianity has lost its right to speak with authority to you about how you use your money. Christian leaders have misused their power. We've seen that in the news so many times, like televangelists using their power to get homebound people on fixed incomes to support their ministries and then turning around and buying a second Lamborghini. There's embezzlement, mismanagement, not to mention how the church misuses spiritual authority to manipulate people into giving. Some of you have been hurt by that in the past. Let's try to be gentle with each other. And yet, Jesus talked about money more than anything else. And financial trouble and financial stress are a huge source of hidden pain in our community. And there's so much good that our money can do in the world to help people live the fully alive life that God created all of us for. So, if we're serious about our mission to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God with our whole lives, we need to talk about how we live with our money. And we need to talk about it as a spiritual discipline. Now, this is not, and if it comes across this way, please tell me gently, this is not a guilt trip into giving to the church. It's not about that. It's about a spiritual discipline and an invitation to transformation to be more like Christ. I've said this many times that often it's our pocketbook that is the last barrier between God and our hearts. So we tiptoe into this fraught territory of talking about money for the next 3 weeks in this generosity series. So what we want for you is for you to envision yourself as a philanthropist. We want you to envision yourself as a philanthropist. You know what a philanthropist is. It's somebody who gives to causes, who supports things that they believe in to help them survive and thrive in the world. Now, it's difficult to imagine yourself being a philanthropist when you live in a community filled with ultra-wealthy families. And that seems out of reach. Like, that's not me, that's not my story, that's not my life. But hear this, even modest earners, which is most of us, have the ability to have a huge positive impact on the world over the course of your lifetime with your money. Even modest earners, think about how much $100 a month builds up over 30 years. Think about how much that could do. And Billy, my husband, could tell you all kinds of things that you could do to make that $100 a month into even more money by investing and by using strategies where you can give charitable donations that aren't taxed, and he would love to talk with you about that. That's not my thing. But we want you to envision yourself as a philanthropist. But how will you do that? So the next 3 Sundays, we're going to suggest 3 practices and values. Today, we're going to talk about growing up with your money. Next week, we're going to talk about the discipline and practice of abundance, and then the 3rd week, we'll talk about the practice and discipline of simplicity. Now, a couple of things. This is not age limited. We're going to talk about growing up with your money, but we all have growing up to do with our money. So if you've been long grown up, age-wise, you still hopefully have things to learn and things to grow in. And this is also not income limited. We want everyone in this room to find something that will lead them more into the fully alive life that God created us to live, whether you earn very little or whether you are at the upper end of your earnings. And if you find yourself in a place where you can't pay your bills, that's a kind of a different conversation, although we all have something we can share. If you're in that situation, please reach out. So many people suffer in silence and hopelessness, but we are a community who seeks to be generous. So please reach out to me or to a deacon. We want to make sure that everyone is cared for. Okay, pause over. Let's move on to our text. So we are going to hear the story of a group of people who's growing up. A group of people who's growing up. And here's what you need to know before we read. We're going to read from the book of Deuteronomy, which is in the Old Testament. So a little bit of the backstory. God had liberated the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt. You may remember things like the 10 plagues and crossing the Red Sea. These were things that happened while God was bringing the Hebrew people out of slavery, and God had promised to give them their own land, that they would become a people, not slaves belonging to someone else, but a people with their own land belonging to God. But after they had crossed the Red Sea and were getting ready to enter the Promised Land, they messed up pretty badly, multiple times. And they ended up wandering around in the desert for 40 years. So they were a nomadic people. First, they were an enslaved people. Then they were a nomadic people. Apparently they had some kinks they needed to work out before they were ready to be settled, and before they could fulfill God's purpose of being a witness to those around them for what God is like. So they went from slavery to being a nomadic people, and now the grandchildren and children of those people who were liberated from slavery are standing at the border of the Promised Land. They're ready to finally have this promise be made real. And their leader, Moses, was not going to be going into the Promised Land with them. There's a whole bunch of stories there too. Moses is giving them their final instructions about how to order their lives once they settle. So we're going to read from Deuteronomy chapter 26. Deuteronomy is basically a long speech from Moses to the Hebrew people, kind of his parting words to them. So as I read, I want you to pay attention to the imperatives. I was a grammar nerd back in school, not really anymore, but the imperatives, the phrase "you shall." What is God commanding them through Moses to do? So pay attention to the "you shalls." When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground, which you harvest from the land the Lord your God is giving you, and you shall put it in a basket and go to the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. You shall go to the priest who is in office at that time and say to him, "Today I declare to the Lord your God that I have come into the land that the Lord swore to our ancestors to give to us." When the priest takes the basket from your hand and sets it down before the altar of the Lord your God, you shall make this response before the Lord your God. "A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien." Here we're picking up on what was originally an oral tradition. Scripture was passed down by telling stories and with phrases, and you can kind of hear this. Can you hear this as like a speech or a story that someone has told hundreds of times? "A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number, and there became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us," so now he's telling them to tell the story of their ancestors and being enslaved, "we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power, and with signs and wonders," talking about the 10 plagues, "and he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. You shall set it down before the Lord your God and bow down before the Lord your God. Then you, together with the Levites and the aliens who reside among you, you shall celebrate with all the bounty that the Lord your God has given to you and to your house." So the commands. You shall take your first fruits. You shall put it in a basket. I love how specific that is. Put it in a basket. You shall go to the priest. You shall make this response. Tell this story. You shall set it down, and then you shall celebrate. Stepping aside from that for a second, part of my practice when I do weddings is 4 sessions of premarital counseling. And in those premarital counseling sessions, we take a deep dive into the biggest areas of potential conflict in marriages. Anyone want to guess what some of those might be? Religion, spirituality, communication, dealing with families, sex, and money. So we use a tool called the genogram, which is basically a chart of your family tree. And you're at the bottom, the person is at the bottom, and each shape represents a member of their family of origin, so parents and grandparents. Of course, most genograms end up looking more like this, with multiple marriages, divorces, step siblings, and conflict. That squiggly zigzag line represents conflict in a relationship. So we plot out each individual's genogram, and then I ask this question. As you enter into this marriage, what do you want to take with you from your families of origin, and what do you want to leave behind? What do you want to take with you, and what do you want to leave behind? It's a question that we all have to grapple with as we grow up, whether we marry or not. And side note, for most of us, growing up takes our whole lives. We're never really done with that. No one is exempt from this work. So, what was given to you by your family that was good? What values, beliefs, practices, communication styles, relationship patterns worked and felt meaningful to you that you want to pass down to your children? Or which ones do you want to live out? And what do you want to leave behind? What was hurtful to you? What did you see that didn't work in the world? What do you not want to pass down? What do you not want to live out? That's essentially what Moses is doing here with the Hebrew people. He's telling the children and the grandchildren of these former slaves in Egypt that their life is going to be different than their parents and their grandparents. Their grandparents were slaves. Their parents were nomads. They didn't have their own crops as slaves. They didn't have crops as nomads. They foraged, and they had animals who traveled around with them. But you, Moses is saying, you're going to plant and you're going to harvest. And this is how I want you to live. It's gonna be different than what your parents practiced. It won't work for you. So, what shall they do? They shall take the first fruits of their first harvest. Can you imagine how precious those first fruits would have been to them after all of this waiting, this land flowing with milk and honey, and finally the bounty of the earth is being brought forth, and God says, take those beautiful first things and bring them, gather them, put them in a basket, take them to the priest, tell your ancestors' story, and then celebrate. That sounds pretty great. Can you imagine that party? Well, we will imagine it in a minute, actually. Hint, hint, over there at the table. So here's the question. I preached on this exact text a year ago. That was what Christina was referring to in her email about first fruits. As usual, there's like 15 sermons that I could preach on any given text. So here's a different one than last year. How does this work out for us exactly? I mean, most of us aren't farmers. So how do you put your first fruits in a basket when you get paid electronically? I mean, we would take it, but coming to church with a basket of cash would be a little bit awkward. How would this work for us? We can't, as you know, as I've said over and over again, we can't just take this text and say, okay, this is God's will for our lives. This is how we're supposed to live. No, we need to think about what did that mean for them? And then what does it mean for us in our modern day lives? So, the first thing I will suggest is to know your circumstances. Know your circumstances. Are you a slave? Are you a nomad? Or are you a settled person? What is required of you in your life with your money? Know where you are and what is required of you. It's not going to be the same as it was for your parents. And it may not be the same for you now as it was 5 years ago. What responsibilities do you have? What liabilities do you have? What assets do you want to build? Know your circumstances. Secondly, is to honor your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents. So many of us in what is several generations of huge amounts of change, and what we know about human behavior and parenting and all kinds of psychology stuff that's been unearthed and the best practices in spirituality, so many of us look at our parents and say, not like that. We don't agree with how they did it. That wasn't helpful to me. And that is important work to do. But notice how Moses commands them to tell their story. They didn't talk about their parents and grandparents who were real mess-ups and had to wander around in the desert for 40 years. They didn't trash talk their parents and say how bad they were and how sinful they were. They told the story of God's faithfulness. They told the story generously about their grandparents and parents. So, you need to know what's going to be different, but honor what came before. There was a reason that they did what they did. Something was going on there. Can you figure out what it was? Can you get curious about why your parents and grandparents acted the way they did? Or maybe yourself, as you look back on your life. Can you get curious rather than being judgmental toward yourself? Honor the past. So know your circumstances, honor the past, and then third, decide your values. Decide your values. That's what Moses invited them into with this first fruits thing. They decided ahead of time. He told them before they went in. He didn't wait until they had their first fruits in their hands and were trying to decide what to do. Oh, by the way, we should give those to God. He told them ahead of time so that they could decide, so that they could make plans, so that they could act it out when they got there. Your invitation is to not go through life reacting, not go through life doing things as they come, but make a decision about how you want to live with your money. Make a decision. And the invitation is to make a decision not only about what's good for you, but also what's good for the world. They were sharing the first fruits. There was a very practical application because the priests who worked in the temple, they did their work in the temple. They didn't tend crops. If they didn't have the giving, what the people of Israel gave to them, they would not eat. Not to mention the people who were too old to farm, the people who had other restrictions, other things in their life that it wouldn't be workable for them. Sharing matters. So, decide your values, and the invitation here is to value not only things for yourself, but also the good of the world. Remember that we are blessed to be a blessing, that we are to care for the orphan and the widow and those who work on our behalf. So this reminds me of a conversation I had with one of my kids recently. That kid wanted to go out for lunch. And it was the end of the month, and I said, nope, we're going to choose not to go out for lunch today because our restaurant budget is overspent. Now, that's not fun for anyone. Like, you come to the end of the month and you've overspent our restaurant budget. And so we had a conversation. He was curious. Well, why do you do that? Why do you plan that way? And because of the work that Billy and I have done, along with the congregation over the past years, I was able to say very clearly, we choose to set limits so that we can meet our financial goals. We have to set limits on ourselves if we're going to meet our financial goals. And then he was curious, well, what are some of your financial goals? And again, because of the work that we have done over the last years, this didn't come naturally to us. It didn't show up automatically. We've worked on it over the last 10 years at least. I was able to say, the first thing I was able to say is one of our goals is to be able to be generous. And we can't do that if we don't set limits. We want to be able to support communities that we're part of so that they can continue to do their work. And we want to be able to be generous when needs arise. We want to be able to respond to that. Billy often says, without budgeting, you can only be generous once. You can't sustain generosity unless you set limits, unless you budget. So, decide your values, and then order your finances around those values. Thirdly, act on your values. I don't know which is harder, deciding your values or acting on them, but act on your values. Be intentional about how you spend your money. Don't just go through life on autopilot, which autopilot is always what was passed down to you from your parents, or a direct opposite, like I'm not going to do that from your parents. That's always the autopilot, is either for your parents or against your parents. But get out of that, act on that, out of your own values, out of what comes out of your values conversation. So we have to talk about budgeting. You can only be generous once, as I said. We want to support you in this work. And as part of acting on your values, we are sharing with you some commitment cards that are in your bulletin. You can pull it out. It's the free piece of paper. There are some reflection questions on one side of the commitment card to encourage conversation with people who you do money with. Reflection questions, actually, they're based on this text. This will help you think about your values and act on them. And then on the other side is a commitment card for how much you will commit to giving to the church. Now, why the church? I said this is not a guilt trip into giving to the church. We don't base our budget, our church budget, on the commitment cards. This is an act of spiritual discipline that we want to practice together and have some accountability around. So that's why we do commitment cards. Now, we realize that there are lots of causes that you support in the world, and that is exactly what we want to encourage. And we believe so strongly in the work that God is doing here that we want to invite you into being part of that as you ponder your own generosity. Because we want to be generous. And without your gifts, we can't do that. We want to be able to respond to needs as they arise. We want to be able to support our community and support this community. So we're inviting you into that. And you can make a commitment to give to the church, but you don't have to. And you can go through the reflection questions and see where God is leading you over the next 3 weeks. Lastly, the command, you shall celebrate. So this one, we tend to ignore it. The you shall celebrate. It's like it's extra. Do all this hard stuff and then we'll celebrate. Yeah, that's But no, really, it has that, the wording of that command is the same as the wording of you shall take your first fruits. You shall celebrate. You shall celebrate. What would it look like for you to celebrate? Christina suggested maybe you celebrate accomplishing the goal of buying a house by giving a gift to Habitat for Humanity to help somebody else give a gift. That could be a thing. Or maybe you tell the story of what happened to people who you care about, who need to know the story of God's faithfulness and of you making it through. How will you celebrate as individuals, as families, as households? How will you celebrate? And it has to be fun. That's a rule that I will make. It has to be fun. And it's not just a private celebration. Together with the Levites and the aliens who reside among you, you shall celebrate. Invite people in. They were told this celebration isn't just for an internal thing. Invite the outsiders in. Share the goodness. A celebration needs to be wide and diverse. So what would it look like for you to celebrate?